There is a funny and frankly kind of sad clip from a 2006 episode of The Colbert Report, in which Stephen Colbert is talking about religion. And he asks the cameraman what his religion is. "I'm a Unitarian," says Bobby. "So you're a Christian too," says Colbert. "Well, yes, or no. I incorporate Christian values as well as aspects of many other religious traditions into my belief in God. And I don't mean to imply that I necessarily think God exists." And the babbling goes on and on from there. When Bobby finally stops, Colbert gives him a long, confused stare, and then asks, "So do you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah?" And Bobby responds, "Sure." This is precisely why knowing our stories, both our individual religious stories and our shared stories of our faith, is important. This week, we conclude our worship series on the story of Unitarian Universalism with an exploration of how we honor our past and believe in our future. The stories of our religious ancestors shape our present and our future, and we have a choice in how they do so. You've heard many of these stories from this pulpit in recent weeks. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Olympia Brown, Theodore Parker, Hosea Ballou. I grew up hearing these stories and many more about our Unitarian Universalist heroes and heroines. The message I got was this: look at these Unitarians and Universalists who did wonderful things and made a positive impact on our world. You, too, can make a difference when you put your UU principles and values into action. As I got older, I came to know the fuller and more complex stories of these people, including their faults and the problematic aspects of their legacies. Take, for example, Susan B. Anthony, a Unitarian suffragist. Before she became prominent in the cause for women's suffrage, she was involved in the abolitionist movement. She was anti-slavery, but she was not anti-racist. In fact, as the writer Bell Hooks wrote, many who were vehement in their anti-slavery protests were totally opposed to granting social equality to Black people. While early in her activism, Anthony called for universal suffrage, the threat of the 15th Amendment being passed, giving African American men suffrage, and the reality of its existence after 1870 angered many white women's suffrage advocates, including Anthony. Her arguments for the cause turned toward blatant racist discourse, claiming the superiority of white women to African American men, of course not even mentioning African American women, and arguing that unlike Black and immigrant men, women, white women, would bring a new element to the government with their virtue and purity. She pitted the alleged holiness and virtuousness of white women against the depravity of Black men, at a time when each needed the other's support the most. Learning this truth in my freshman college class on religious feminisms in America was eye-opening, to say the least. It taught me that while it's okay to honor what people have given to our tradition and the positive contributions they made, we must also acknowledge their faults and the things that we don't wish to celebrate. It was a lesson in intersectional activism that I have carried with me ever since. As Martin Luther King said, "No one is free until we are all free." Later in my college career, I had the opportunity to study in Ghana, where I learned about Sankofa, a powerful symbol and a Twi word that translates as "go back and get it." The symbol is a bird with feet facing forward, but its head turned backwards, carefully taking an egg off its back into its mouth. It is a symbol of taking from the past what is good and bringing it into the present, using your knowledge of that past to continue the goodness of its legacy. This symbol has been adopted within African American culture to express the importance of going back to your roots in order to move forward. It lifts up the possibility of reclaiming, reviving, and perpetuating what has been lost, forgotten, or stripped away. While it takes on a very particular meaning within that context, among a group of people for whom stories of the past include being stripped of their culture, homeland, and humanity, I think it can have meaning for all of us as people of faith who seek to honor our religious past while believing in and taking responsibility for shaping its future. The poem, A House Called Tomorrow, our reading this morning, is full of affirmations and advice that guide us on this journey. The poet Alberto Rios writes, "You are bringing with you in every breath and in every step everyone who has come before you. Just as our familial ancestors breathed life into every step we take today, we carry with us the breath of our religious ancestors." I like to think of the process of inheriting our ancestors' legacy as like the process of breathing. What we breathe in is not what we breathe out. They're not the same exact stuff. When we breathe in, the oxygen in that breath dissolves in our blood, moves around our body, and is used to produce energy in the moments following or even hours later. What comes out when we exhale is carbon dioxide, the components of which come from the food we've eaten in recent hours or days. What we breathe in from the stories of our religious past is not what we breathe out. It goes through a process of transformation. The poet writes, "You are made fundamentally from the good. You are the good who has come forward through it all, even if so many days feel otherwise." That is, we are shaped by both the good and the bad stories of our past. But ideally, we are an expression of the good that has come forward. The poem reminds us, when you as a child learned to speak, it is not that you didn't know words. It's that from the centuries you knew so many, and it's hard to choose the words that will be your own. We know so many stories from our past, but which ones do we choose to make our own? Finally, the poet advises, look back only for as long as you must, then go forward into the history you will make. Like the bird of the Sankofa symbol, we turn our heads backward to retrieve the stories and legacies from the past, but then we face forward again, making our own stories and legacies with the materials we have. Now, this is a lot of metaphorical imagery. So what does it mean for us as Unitarian Universalists? The larger story of Unitarian Universalism contains many of the stories of Judaism and Christianity. We, your ministers, often liken this to cultural heritage. If my parents or grandparents were Italian or Mexican and I was born in the United States, I may identify as Italian or Mexican American. As part of this, I might observe some of the holidays, eat the food, or identify with my heritage, but not call myself Italian or Mexican. Similarly, there are Jewish people in the United States who have a variety of theologies. Their parents or grandparents may have come from Eastern Europe, and while they don't practice Judaism in the way that their ancestors did, they still very much identify culturally as Jewish. Unitarian Universalism has a similar relationship to Christianity. Our diverse theologies may differ from our religious ancestors 200 or 1,000 years ago, but our culture is steeped in Christianity. We are still churches, we have ministers, your ministers preach sermons, and we sing hymns, and we meet for worship, all forms familiar to Christian churches, yet very much shaped to reflect who we are. On the other hand, we have abandoned the dogma and the creeds of our religious ancestors. We must not exclude or cut ourselves off from the Christian stories. We must not abandon the stories and radical theologies in which our Unitarian Universalist tradition is rooted. And we must not forget both the gifts of our religious heritage and its more painful legacies. All of these we must claim, preserve, examine anew for the truth they have for our lives, and make them our own. I believe that one of our greatest challenges in continuing to write the story of Unitarian Universalism is to build our comfort with the language and forms of our roots, and to employ that language to deepen our faith and transform structures and theologies that oppress. This is what our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors have done for centuries. They have remained firmly rooted in their heritage, but have made it their own and transformed it for their time. Each of us has the opportunity to do so for our lives and for our faith community. The Reverend Pat Hortdorfer, a UU religious educator from whom I've learned a lot, once said, "Our stories are not just individual stories. They are embedded in our family stories, in extended family stories, and in our local community stories, as well as part of the stories of our congregation and our faith tradition. The living tradition of our Unitarian Universalist faith puts our little story in a universal context." She says we need sustaining stories on all levels so that we know who we are, to whom we belong, and what we stand for. My hope for you and for our faith community as a whole is that we might learn from our stories, our individual, family, extended family, community stories, and the stories of our church and our faith tradition. Let these stories sustain us and strengthen us so that, unlike Bobby the cameraman, we know who we are, to whom we belong, and what we stand for. May it be so. Amen.